Today we're going to start masking off all of the areas of the pack that we do not want to have texture. So I'm just going to be using some masking tape, frog tape, and a utility knife to trim the tape back. So we're going to do both parts of the shell, the top and bottom half of the shell. I'm going to mask off everything that doesn't get texture. And then we're going to start to spray our texture, which I'm going to use a couple different paints that I'll show you about in just a few seconds. Okay, so after what seems like an eternity, I've gotten everything masked off that I don't want to have texture, and we're going to get ready to start spraying. So to add the texture today, I'm going to try this Rust-Oleum truck bed coating. This is not something I've used before. I normally use the Rust-Oleum cast, but I've seen a lot of people use this. They seem to like it, so we're going to give this a try. So we're going to do a few coats of this, and then we're going to do remove all the masking and lay down a top coat of flat black. So here's the pack shell after a few coats of the truck bed lining. I'm not overly impressed with that as a coating, as a finish for the pack. I found that it's a little bit hard to get on evenly, and there's a few drips and runs I'll have to clean up when everything is completely dry. But I'm going to go ahead now, it's been drying for about an hour, and remove all the masking tape. Let this dry at least overnight, and then we'll go ahead and apply the flat black top coat to everything, to the entire pack, including everything that's already been covered with the truck bed liner. Okay, so masking tape has all been removed. Now we're going to put down the final top coat, and for the final top coat I'm going to be using Rust-Oleum Professional. This is flat black. I really like the sheen of this. It's got just the tiniest hint of a sheen. It's not the same as a matte black. Flat black will give a very nice finish for us to do a little bit of weathering on once that's dry. So I'm going to go ahead and set this up to spray. Put down probably 2 or 3 light coats over the whole thing, put this back together, and we'll move on to applying decals and a little bit of weathering. Okay, so here's the shell after a few coats of the Rust-Oleum flat black. I'm going to start to reassemble this now, and we're going to get some decals put on there and start doing some weathering. Okay, we're ready to start reassembling the pack. And once we're reassembled, I'm going to put decals on. I've got a set from Moby Decal Shop, and we'll do some weathering. So I've just about finished reassembling the pack. I still need to add the ribbon cable and assemble the ion arm. So I'm going to do the ribbon cable next. We have a hose clamp here, so we're going to drill a hole up on the ladder right here to mount that. I've got a socket cap screw. And then I am going to drill out the mounting bosses for this cable clamp. This particular pack style has a removable one, so I'm going to drill those out because I'm going to run socket cap screws through that to clamp down the cable. It will be more screen accurate and actually will hold the clamp in place. The last thing I need to do still is reassemble the ion arm. I'm going to add the brass rod to it. So this is the bottom plate, the bottom cover of the ion arm that I need to drill out for installing the brass rod. So I picked this up at the hardware store. It's the toilet float valve. They're a couple dollars from Home Depot or Lowe's. We'll cut that to length. What I want to try to do is drill a hole through this plate to mount it, and I've got a locking nut here I'm going to install on the back side of it to hold it in place. As it turns out, that nut fits very nicely right in between there, so I'm going to mark the center of that to drill, and then I'm going to trim off some of the threads so that it will clear the inside of here when I put the screws back through to hold the ion arm in place. So the tip of the Sharpie should just reach through, hit the center, there it is. So I'm going to drill that out, and then we'll trim off enough of the threads on the brass rod so that when I put the nut on, it stops just at the end of the nut. So there's the finished brass rod. You can see I cut off some of the threads. It's a neat trick to do this before you cut it off. Put the nut on it, put it in a vise or whatever, cut it off. And when you cut it with a hacksaw, you can see that. Get your hacksaw blade lined up in between the threads and then cut. And if you can stay in between the threads and cut, you won't have a problem getting the nut back off. You'll have a clean thread. You won't have to chase it out or anything. If you cut across the threads, like if you cut straight, you won't be able to get the nut back on to the threads. So cut along with the threads in between. I ended up not being able to use the nylock nut that I wanted to use because when I tried to put it in there, it was really making the brass rod go in at an angle. And then I cut the rod to about 4 1/4 inches long. The full-size pack would be about 5 inches. I scaled it down a little bit, kind of eyeballed it, decided 4 1/4 looked good, and then just cut it off. You can see I just threw it on the belt sander and put a little taper on it. So nothing fancy. Costs about $2 to make that. So this is the pack, nearly completely assembled at this point. The only thing I'm going to do now is apply a little bit of weathering. I personally don't like to do tons of weathering on the packs. I like to just add a little bit of detail to it to show that, you know, if it was an actual used pack, it's been through some stuff, has some wear and tear, but generally I don't like them to be too grimy. I like to imagine that if a scientist was using his equipment, it would be worn but still clean and well maintained. So to do the weathering that I want to do on this, I'm going to use this spray paint. This I've found has a very realistic metallic aluminum finish. It's probably the best one I've found that actually looks like metal. And I'm going to apply it with an old toothbrush. And the reason I like the toothbrush is because if you're just trying to give some wear to this to make it look like this is worn metal, you get kind of a nice grainy, scratchy finish, which to me looks very realistic, as you would expect it to have, a pack like this to have some bumps and scrapes from banging into things over time. So what I'm going to do is basically just spray a little bit of the spray paint into this paper towel and then just very gently dip the toothbrush into it and then just apply some scrapes and scuffs to a few places. when I do that, I'm trying to pick out the high points on the pack, the things that are the most likely to get bumped. So maybe a little bit down here along the edge of the end filter, on the bumpers, maybe on the bottom of the cyclotron where you would think it would get chipped from being set down. A little bit of wear here from being bumped around, a little bit on top here. Not going to go crazy, just a little bit to add wear and tear. I think in this case, typically less is more. So we'll take a So, once again, just a little bit. And you can see how little paint is actually on the brush. And we're just going to think about sort of the spots along here where we would expect some bumps and scrapes may have happened. Just kind of adding some weathering and fading effect to the edge. So you can see how subtle that is, but it really adds a lot. Maybe down here that it's been banged into something. A little bit of wear here along the edge of the filter. You can kind of see that, what that adds to everything. Again, I try not to go too heavy on this, just trying to pick out some of the high points where I would expect the pack to have been bumped. Gonna hit a little bit on the edges here. So very, very little paint actually goes on to this. The more paint you add, the more pronounced the effect will be. So you got to kind of be cautious. If you want it to be a little bit more chipped, you can get a little heavier with the paint and kind of press it directly on. Ignore my messy garage. Get a little here. Bit more along the bumper. Kind of see what's going on there. And we'll hit, because there's so little paint on here, you can kind of create a very natural looking wear pattern just adds a little bit of more metallic finish along the edges especially. Just like that. So very, very subtle. See, that looks really nice there along the edge of the end filter, very convincing. I think that really looks actually worn, and again, subtle. I don't think you need to go too nuts with this unless you're trying to make it look like your pack has been through a war and is pretty old with a lot of miles on it, which, like I said, not a look that I'm particularly crazy about personally, but this is a matter of personal preference. A little bit here. Get some So I'm not going to do too much more with this, I don't think. I'm kind of happy with this. Like I said, just some subtle weathering. Nothing too crazy. Just enough to make it look like it's been around a bit. You can, if you want, do some washes. I'm going to try maybe a little bit of a brown wash just to weather the labels a little bit, just to make them look like they've been wiped down with stuff before. But that's about it. I'm not going to go nuts on this particular build.